Donna Tartt begins her novel The Secret History with two quotations. The first is from Nietzsche, from his incomplete essay entitled We Philologists, Section 2. Quote, I inquire now as to the genesis of a philologist, and assert the following. 1. A young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. 2. He does not know whether he is suited for finding out about them. End quote. The second quote is from Plato, from Book 2 of the Republic. Quote, Come then, and let us pass a leisure hour in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes. End quote. So we have two philosophers, one modern, one ancient, one an immoralist, the other a moralist, one a realist, the other an idealist, that provide us with the dedication for the secret history. The uniting thread is education. Plato's concern with education comes through in much of his work, but particularly in the work cited, The Republic, in which the ideal state is founded by establishing the proper education for the citizens within it. And Nietzsche's concern with education also dominates his attention, particularly during the period of the untimely meditations, which that incomplete essay We Philologists was originally included among the untimely meditations. And this concern is inextricably linked with Nietzsche's concern with culture. Nietzsche's view is that the true purpose of an education is to introduce us to the perennial questions that confront all mankind, and which are therefore not of a personal nature, but of a supra-personal nature. What is the good life? How is it achieved? How are we to face death? How are we to justify our lives in the face of suffering and death? Such questions do not confront some portion of humanity, but all humanity. The way that we answer these questions, or even if we don't have a clear-cut answer, just the way that we think about these questions and how we act in light of that thinking, that is what really constitutes a culture, and it is the job of the educator to indoctrinate us into that culture, not to teach us a million trivial facts that we forget as soon as we leave the institution. Nietzsche, as a philologist himself and a scholar of classical antiquity, sees in the Greeks and Romans almost nothing of that romantic perspective that treats these cultures as though they were nature's darling children, or as if their main traits were placid cheerfulness and sweetness and light. That was how Matthew Arnold characterized the Greeks, for example. Nietzsche's main critique in Birth of Tragedy was leveled against the view that the Greeks were cheerful, in the sense of being naive, simple, or easygoing. In Nietzsche's opposing view, the Greeks are a tragic culture. They are excessive in everything that they do, and this Hellenic excess is almost their defining trait. We are, in fact, easily fooled by the dictum, all things in moderation, or the admonition at Delphi, nothi sothon, know thyself. Because it is quite easy to forget that a people only has to remind themselves to be moderate if it is normal for them to be immoderate. They only have to remind themselves to possess self-knowledge because they are wont to forget themselves. Socratic philosophy is not representative of Greek culture in general, according to Nietzsche, but is its monstrous inversion. In fact, Nietzsche sees the entirety of Socratic and Platonic philosophy as yet another great excess, in this case a great and extraordinary reaction against the pre-existing culture. The norm was proud ignorance, inherited beliefs, a delight in cruelty and sensuousness, a disdain for pity, for labor, for useless knowledge. The beating heart of this Greek culture, for Nietzsche, is the Dionysian. Dionysus represents the ritual madness at the center of the Hellenic world, a celebration of the beast in man, a return to nature, but in the opposite sense of the placid romantics. Nietzsche says it is an unleashing of the witch's brew of violence and sexuality, the destruction of the individual persona, and a violation of all the ordering norms of Greek society. That is the Dionysian. And to withstand this maelstrom, the Greeks are equally excessive in their Apollonian tendencies. Apollo represents the boundary drawing, the hierarchical, the orderly, this interplay between these mutually hostile forms of expression, the twin art deities, Apollo and Dionysus, creates Greek tragedy. We can understand Nietzsche's quotation, therefore, as saying that the Greek culture was so foreign from our own that it is no small wonder that some of the best minds in philology have not really approached them. Instead, they've projected their own modern prejudices onto the Greeks, or else imagined the Greeks as a kind of idyllic fantasy, an Edenic culture, which appears attractive to us precisely because we now live within industrial modernity. Accordingly, in the section that Tartt quotes from at the beginning, Nietzsche concludes, quote, "In short, 99 philologists out of 100 should not be philologists at all." End quote. Most of us are simply not cut out to experience the Dionysian. And if we cannot experience that, the defining experience of the Hellenic culture, then how can we understand the Greeks? And so we must ask, in light of this, what would it mean for a modern person who wishes to know the Greeks to experience the Dionysian for themselves? This book, The Secret History, is a story about exactly that. Modern people who fall in love with the ancient Greeks, or at least are seduced by them, and who experience the Dionysian. And for the most part, it destroys them. The tale takes place almost in its entirety on a university campus. Hampden College, a fictional campus in the fictional town of Hampton, Vermont. But the nature of the education of the main characters, the education of our heroes, as Plato puts it, the education that concerns us, is not the book learning of the modern university, but precisely this Dionysian experience. It's like a rite of passage that the main characters must pass through with no way of knowing ahead of time whether they are up to the experience. Tartt's novel is a love letter to ancient Greece. It's also an homage to the Greek tragedies in which the main characters are torn to pieces by a fate engineered by the gods. The beauty in any tragic story is paradoxically found in the terrible destruction of its characters. We voyeuristically absorb a story of a noble character's downfall and degradation and receive a mysterious kind of enjoyment from the experience, which cannot be reduced to sadism or to catharsis or to wallowing in melancholy. There's a strange way in which seeing the inevitable tragedy of life, because all life is tragic in this impermanent and unsatisfying world of ours, in which death awaits all of us at the end, there's a way in which that becomes beautiful when it is immortalized and celebrated in the dramatic form. Nietzsche calls it a kind of transcendent, superordinate joy that accompanies even the most horrific tragedy. In this story, just as in one of Tartt's main influences from the ancient world, the play The Bakai, the tragic narrative is itself a kind of meta-celebration of the tragic form. And in both of those stories, The Secret History and The Bakai, the god Dionysus appears as the main inciter of the action. Or does he? We'll return to that question in a bit. The narrator of the novel and our main character is Richard Papen. He introduces himself by telling us the most important thing about him. Quote, "Does such a thing as the fatal flaw, that showy dark crack running down the middle of a life, exist outside literature? I used to think it didn't. Now I think it does. And I think that mine is this: a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs." End quote. He then quotes Arthur Rimbaud, quote, "A moi, la historie d'un de mes folies," end quote. And even if your French is as bad as mine, you should be able to figure that one out, considering that we just covered Foucault and his History of Madness, or Histoire de la Folie. We might roughly translate Rimbaud's phrase, quote, "My turn, the history of my madness," end quote. In other words, Richard's madness, his obsession, the main value that he's looking for in life, is aesthetic. We might think of Nietzsche's coinage from Birth of Tragedy. It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that life is eternally justified. That, in a nutshell, is Richard Papen's justification for life. And there is a meta-element to this, because Richard is telling us that because he finds this singular obsession within himself that he calls a fatal flaw, he now believes that these fatal flaws exist not just in literature but in real life. But Richard isn't a character in real life, he's a character in literature. So even in perhaps an unconscious or intuitive way, These opening sentences remind us that we're reading a book, that Tartt is drawing our attention in a subtle way to what we're all looking for when we open the pages of a novel like this, the heightening of life, its justification through aesthetics. Whether or not you find Richard to be a sympathetic character will probably depend on whether you find yourself to be a similar type of person. As Richard tells us of the boring reality of his early life in Plano, California, he says that even his recollection of the town has become a, quote, dazzle of this fictive childhood, end quote, which has, quote, eclipsed the drab original, end quote. It's like you can't help but cover everything over with this aesthetic gloss. Richard came from an ordinary lower middle class family, from a place where he had no real prospects to pursue the kind of beautiful life that he's imagined for himself. When he reaches university age, he finds that he excels at Greek, and he wants above all to study Greek, but his parents forbid it, wishing for him to get a practical, lucrative education. Richard defies them and manages to get into Hampton. Quote, Hampden College, Hampton, Vermont, established 1895. This alone was a fact to cause wonder. Nothing I knew of in Plano had been established much before 1962. End quote. What Richard wants is to leave modern-day West Coast America, where everything is new, where his future would be in some dead-end job or taking up the family business, and venture into a realm which at the moment only exists in his fantasies. He says his head is swimming in Greek myths and philosophies at this time. Hampton represents something because it's older than anything he knows in his ordinary life. It's a place where one could seem to reconnect with the ancient, and it is described as quite literally dreamlike, beyond anything Richard had ever imagined, magical in some way, apart from the world that he grew up in. Quote, I had never been east of Santa Fe, never north of Portland. And when I stepped off the bus after a long, anxious night that had begun somewhere in Illinois, it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and the sun was rising over the mountains and birches and impossibly green meadows. And to me, dazed with night and no sleep and 3 days on the highway, it was a country from a dream. The dormitories weren't even dorms, or at any rate not like the dorms I knew, with cinder block walls and depressing yellowish light, but white clapboard houses with green shutters set back from the commons in groves of maple and ash. All the same, it never occurred to me that my particular room, wherever it might be, would be anything but ugly and disappointing, and it was with something of a shock that I saw it for the first time. A white room with big north-facing windows, monkish and bare, with scarred oak floors and a ceiling slanted like a garret's. On my first night there, I sat on the bed during the twilight while the walls went slowly from gray to gold to black, listening to a soprano's voice climb dizzily up and down somewhere at the other end of the hall until at last the light was completely gone, and the faraway soprano spiraled on in the darkness like some angel of death, and I can't remember the air ever seeming as high and cold and rarefied as it was that night, or ever feeling farther away from the low-slung lines of dusty Plano. Those first days before classes started, I spent alone in my whitewashed room in the bright meadows of Hampton, and I was happy in those first days, as really I'd never been before, roaming like a sleepwalker, stunned and drunk with beauty. End quote. What Richard doesn't know when he is accepted to Hampton, or a thought that might not have even crossed his mind, is that Hampton is an institution for the elite. Though we no longer have a formal class system in modernity, and we never had one in America, Hampton is the den of aristocrats nonetheless. And Richard, even though he may share the name of an English king, and as Julian points out later, his last name is sort of similar to the name of a French king, he is, for all intents and purposes, a commoner. Whatever he is, he's not one of the elite. And we notice immediately, as he attempts to get in with a new group of friends at the college, that Richard reflexively lies and represents himself as if he were one of them. Part of this behavior is understandable. It's undoubtedly the urge to fit in. But given what Richard has told us about himself, we have to understand this aspect of his character as part of his desire to take possession of this aesthetic dream. He wants a new life with new friends as part of an aesthetic idea that he wishes to fulfill. And personally, I get the impression that his misrepresentation of himself is an act that's not solely for the sake of blending in or schmoozing for the sake of career advancement or something vain and materialistic like that. Rather, he acts the appropriate part because he wishes to become absorbed into the scene. And notice the language that describes his new life. It's dreamlike. He's drunk with beauty. It's far away from dusty, boring Plano. He's in another world, an aesthetic world that he's never known. For the first time, he's happy. And as somebody who is above all aesthetic in his concerns, Richard is an actor, and a rather good actor. And so he begins attempting to act the role. Richard is told by his academic advisor, however, that the Greek program is run by a professor with very odd ideas, whose classes are listed in the general catalog but are, for all intents and purposes, closed. He selects only the students that he wishes, and the number is very small. You have to not only be familiar with Greek to be accepted, but also have read the right things, hold the right views. Richard goes to see him. His name is Julian Morrow, a distinguished scholar, a man who, we learn throughout the novel, seems to know everyone, to have rubbed elbows with all of high society, even taught international royalty. And he tells Richard that he's dreadfully sorry, but he can't accept any more students. He only has 5 at the moment, but Julian still says there's no room for Richard in the program. Perhaps because of the very fact that entry into the program has been denied to him, Richard watches these 5 students studying under Julian with a kind of longing. It seems as though joining this program is the one thing that he cannot have, even as his entry into Hampton in the first place was admittedly somewhat miraculous. And so these 5 people come to almost represent the thing that he wants most, to become one of them. They represent something to Richard before he even knows them as people. Julian's favorite student, and the one that Richard describes to us first, is Henry Winter. He's tall, firm-jawed, literally and figuratively stands out from the rest of the crowd, walking stiffly through the throngs of hippies, as Tartt describes him. A man who we will come to know over the course of the book as unbelievably erudite, practically fluent in Greek and Latin, serious and stoic, and so absorbed with the ancient world that he has almost entirely lost touch with the modern. Because of this, he is too strange, too diffuse to be at home in the modern world. At one point, he's described as a, quote, Mycroft Holmes of philology, end quote. There are 4 others in the group, the twins, a boy and a girl, Charles and Camila Macaulay. They're described as inseparable and instantly recognizable as the only twins at the college, both with dark blonde hair and a countenance that seems equally serious and cheerful. Then there's Francis, who's described as precariously thin, who comes from an incredibly wealthy family in Boston. He's stylish, confident. We later learn that he's gay and in the closet. Finally, Bunny Corcoran, Bunny being short for Edmund, who almost seems like the odd man out. He's described as sloppy with sandy hair, always wearing the same shapeless brown tweed jacket, with a voice that's loud and honking. Richard regards them from afar until one day, when he is in the library at the same time as these students, he overhears a discussion on how to translate a particular phrase from Greek to English, and they can't really agree. Richard offers a helpful suggestion, revealing to him that he has some knowledge of the language, and they're impressed, and they encourage him to approach Julian again about being accepted into the program. Richard tries a second time, and Julian is willing to reconsider, with the condition that Richard must drop his other classes and change his counselor to Julian Morrow. Richard will take all of his classes with Julian, except for French, and devote himself entirely to his studies in the classics, if he's to be accepted. We learn in this scene that though the administration doesn't like it, Julian only accepts a small number of students and demands this strong level of control over their education. He opines that it is detrimental to a student to have many teachers. Quote, "It is better to know one book intimately than 100 superficially. I know the modern world tends not to agree with me, but after all, Plato had only one teacher, and Alexander." End quote. Julian also waxes philosophical about the fact that what we call psychology was once understood in ancient times as fate. He identifies Richard as a romantic, and Richard says the romantics made the best classicists. But Julian echoes the wisdom of Nietzsche that, quote, the great romantics are often failed classicists. But that's beside the point, isn't it? End quote. And after this remarkable conversation, Richard accepts the terms, and Julian accepts him as a student. Richard's advisor, Georges Laforgue, warns him about Julian when Richard makes the decision. Laforgue draws attention to the elitism of Julian Morrow. Quote, forgive me, but I should think the elitist values of such a man would be repugnant to you. Frankly, this is the first time I have ever heard of his accepting a pupil who was on such considerable financial aid. Being a democratic institution, Hampden College is not founded on such principles. Well, he can't be all that elitist if he accepted me, I said. He didn't catch my sarcasm. I am willing to speculate that he isn't aware you are on assistance, he said seriously. Well, if he doesn't know, I said, I'm not going to tell him. End quote. Against all odds, Richard succeeds in fitting in with the aristocrats, and he's quickly accepted into the group of now 6 friends who seem to be relatively isolated from the rest of the students and professors at the college. The Lyceum of Julian Morrow is like a college within the college, and aside from his acquaintanceship with some of his dorm mates, characters like Judy, people he meets at the occasional party, these 6 people become basically the only people in Richard's life, the main actors in the tragedy that they are about to enact. And for what it's worth, there's a very interesting dynamic, especially at the beginning of the novel, in that the group seems to genuinely like Richard. The twins invite him to their apartment. The group spends their weekends out at Francis's country house, where they drink together and swim together and discuss the classics. And there's almost something Epicurean about it, a gathering of philosophical friends who withdraw from the rest of the world. And we come to understand that Henry is the leader of the group, the one they all look up to, who feels implicitly responsible for all of them. When Camila steps in a shard of glass while they're swimming in the lake, he is the one who carries her back to the house, while Richard, meanwhile, is reflecting on the aesthetic beauty of the whole scene, so very much on brand for Richard. But it sort of shows that Henry is the one who takes charge when there's a crisis. And they all sort of share the dream about moving in together at Francis's house once he inherits it, living a life of leisure and contemplation. And this kind of self-absorbed aristocratic way of life that the main characters desire has been a source of criticism for the novel. Many readers are turned off by this. But personally, I think it's easy to understand the appeal of wanting to go be a philosopher unbound from worldly concerns. The simple fact is that there's little that is morally good in the worldviews of these main characters. From the perspective of the conventional morality, they are not good people. They are self-absorbed and arrogant and have no compunction about acting immorally to get what they want, as we'll see. And soon the group has a problem, and that problem is Bunny. It wouldn't really be a spoiler to reveal that the members of the group eventually all join together and murder their friend Bunny Corcoran. This is revealed in the prologue of the book in the first sentences, as Richard recounts the aftermath of Bunny's death and the profound effect that this murder has had on his life. Whereas before, Richard says he may have had many stories to tell, now he only has one story, this defining year in his life. This is the meaning of the title, The Secret History. This is Richard's attempt to give us a candid account of everything that has happened, which is something that he can never reveal publicly for obvious reasons. It's the story of how my friends and I committed a murder and got away with it. I will note at this point, however, if you haven't read the book, this is the point where you should probably stop listening and go pick up a copy and read it. Because we're going to get into major spoilers now, and that isn't to say that knowing the major plot points in the novel will ruin it necessarily. I think, like many of the tragedians, Tartt tells us what's going to happen before it happens, quite intentionally. It's such that the experience of the story is not diminished by this, but enhanced by it. Some people have classified this novel as a murder mystery, but it's not at all. We know exactly who did the murder right at the beginning, and I mean, really, there's no mystery element to it at all. To the extent that there is mystery involved in the story, it's mystery having to do with the motivations and the inner life of the characters, which is a central theme in the story, that distinction between truth and appearance, which we will discuss at length as we get into the story. But anyway, I'm going to be vivisecting and analyzing a lot of the philosophical content of the novel from here on out, and it's simply better to experience the narrative yourself before you hear my analysis of it, because that'll bias the way that you experience it and the way you interpret the characters and events. It's just better to read the story first. So, from here on out, you've been warned. The impetus for Bunny's murder is the bacchanalia. 4 of the members of this student group become seduced by the idea of experiencing the Dionysian mysteries for themselves. These 4 are Henry, the 2 twins, Charles and Camila, and Francis. I'm going to refer to these 4 characters as the 4 bacchants for shorthand, because it's the original 5 students before Richard joins the class, but excluding Bunny. Bunny was initially included, but he wasn't taking it seriously, they say. He kept ruining it. And as for Richard, Henry says, they couldn't include him because they barely knew him. They didn't know how he would react. And I think it's rather obvious that many times throughout the story, the 4 bacchants lie to Richard. He's the newest member of the group, and there's a sense in which his friendship is still probationary, and that he isn't fully included. He's at the bottom of the hierarchy, so to speak. And that's an aspect that comes out very well in this novel that I think is very real, but is obscured by modern idealistic notions of friendship in which we conceive of friendship as something between equals. Whereas in real life, that is rarely the case. I mean, there was that study recently that as many as 50% of the people that you think of as your friends don't think of you as their friend. And if you find that depressing, well, there's also probably some people out there who think of you as a friend and you don't reciprocate their friendship, right? And further than that, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think that's one of the flaws with how some people interpret or criticize this novel, is they're sort of trying to categorize, are the bacchants manipulating Richard? Are they using him and he's not really their friend at all? Or is it a genuine friendship? And the fact of the matter is that in real life, oftentimes we have these unequal relationships of friendship, where maybe I like you 75% of the way and you only like me 25%, or something like that. Obviously, these are just abstract numbers. But I think the point is clear. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Are they real friends or are they false friends? That in actuality, our social relationships often involve many of those aspects that we would like to imagine are not included, again, like hierarchy, exploitation, or being willing to use other people. And there are certainly cases where somebody is willing to be used for the sake of maintaining a friendship. And we might consider that, unhealthy or not a true friendship. It's not the platonic form of a friendship. Whatever somebody might say, the fact remains that in reality in social cliques, this kind of dynamic happens all the time. And I think many of the people who are turned off by this novel are kind of just put off by looking at a reality that may be ugly to them, that friendship isn't this like pure platonic love between equals. Now, the group eventually has their Dionysian experience. They met Dionysus or experienced Dionysus. And at the end of the bacchanalia, Henry killed someone. It was accidental, an act taken within that hallucinatory heightened reality. He lashed out to attack something that he presumably thought was attacking him. And when they come to and come back into consciousness, Henry has put his fist through a Vermont farmer's head. They ended up miles away from where they began the ritual, having somehow crossed onto this farmer's land. And it's by chance that Bunny reads about this death in the news, notices inconsistencies about Henry's story, about where he was that night. He initially sort of suggests it as a joke, oh, maybe Henry's the murderer. But soon he realizes from Henry's answers and from his behavior that he's actually onto something. And Bunny doesn't take this seriously either. He's constantly making jokes and innuendos, even in public, trying to get a rise out of Henry, make him nervous. And Henry comes to feel that even if Bunny doesn't go to the cops, he's going to get them caught through sheer carelessness, if nothing else. This is further compounded by Bunny reading Henry's diary when they're on vacation together in Rome. This gives Bunny confirmation of the deed and confirmation of how Henry really feels about him. And the only reason why they're on vacation in the first place together is because Bunny has been effectively extorting Henry for large sums of money. He basically took him as a way to placate him. And the same with Francis. He's been extracting wealth from him as well. The four Bacchantes had the thought of fleeing to Argentina. It's another thing they didn't tell Richard, and he discovers their plan before they call it off. That's just another way that Richard is sort of excluded from their inner circle. Eventually, Henry confesses to Richard everything that's happened, and he tells him that they're going to kill Bunny. Soon they'll run out of money to appease him, and Bunny's behavior is just erratic enough he could turn them in at any moment. Richard agrees to help, and they carry out this murder to protect themselves, and Richard participates at no advantage to himself, only to protect his friends. He's doing it to protect the beautiful aesthetic life he's created, that Bunny's actions could threaten to destroy. When Bunny wanders off into the woods, drunk, the group ambushes him, surrounds him, and Henry pushes him off a cliff. The second half of the book consists for the search effort for Bunny, since they can't find his body initially, and the inquisitions of the FBI and the police. And then Bunny's funeral, the rest of the spring semester. It's the part of the story where the tension, the pressure is turned up on all the characters. They're charged with keeping the secret. They're bound together as a group by that shared secret. The most significant event from the end of the novel is when Julian discovers that he's been mailed a letter from Bunny, which he assumes to be a prank. It was somehow sent to the wrong professor's mailbox and sat there for months. This letter accuses Henry of murder and expresses Bunny's fears that Henry's going to murder him too. Julian is willing to dismiss it as a hoax until he notices the hotel watermark from the hotel that Bunny and Henry stayed at in Rome. From this, he knows it must have been sent by Bunny. There's a very awkward confrontation between Julian, Henry, and Richard over this, and while Julian gives them back the letter and apparently keeps his silence, in the end, Julian departs unexpectedly from the college. His things are packed, he's gone, perhaps spooked by the murder and what it might do to his reputation, or else disappointed in Henry in some way. Or perhaps Julian was Dionysus himself, there to sow a little bit of chaos in human form and then disappear. In the end, the pressures destroy the main characters. Charles, who has always had a problem with alcohol, now becomes a full-blown alcoholic. It's revealed that he's had an incestuous relationship with his sister and is jealous and protective of her, and he spirals into a depression upon realizing Camilla's romantic relationship with Henry. He gets a DUI, and Richard has to go bring him home from the courthouse. Francis begins having crippling anxiety. He ends up at the hospital suffering attacks of hypochondria. Richard abuses pills and spirals into his own depression as he realizes that the group is breaking apart and the life that he sought after is dissolving. Meanwhile, Henry is worried that Charles is going to break and tell about the group's murders. Charles fears, perhaps rightly, that Henry will kill him to keep him from speaking out, and Charles begins to abuse Camila. She eventually leaves Charles to stay with Henry in a rented apartment. In a drunken confrontation, Charles attempts to kill Henry, but accidentally shoots Richard. Henry takes the gun, whispers something in Camilla's ear, and then shoots himself. In the aftermath of this experience, the characters mostly go off to ignominious fates, we could say. Francis is forced into a marriage with a woman in order to appease his wealthy family, in spite of the fact that he is gay. Charles never recovers from his alcoholism. He leaves Camila alone to care for their grandmother. And finally, Richard has fallen in love with Camila over the course of the story, but she doesn't return his affections. She says, quote, "I love Henry," end quote. Richard tells her that he loved Henry too. "Isn't that enough?" he asks. But she says no, it isn't. The novel concludes with Richard's enigmatic dream that we will discuss at the very end of the episode. So now we will get further into analysis of the story and the themes. First, I want to say that Tartt does something pretty brilliant in the early pages of the book, insofar as Bunny Corcoran is revealed to be an intensely unlikable person in many respects, that we're meant to have a visceral reaction to. The main incident that establishes this is when Bunny insists on taking Richard out to dinner at a restaurant that's not cheap. And then he proceeds to gossip about the other members of their group. He makes homophobic remarks, he orders a bunch of drinks and is rude to the waitstaff, and then he says, "Whoops, I forgot my wallet. Can you cover it?" And Richard, being a commoner, quite literally cannot cover the bill. Bunny calls Henry, who comes to pick them up, pay for the meal, and bail Richard out of the situation. As he drops Richard off at his dorm, he apologizes to him. Richard says it was probably an honest mistake, but Henry points out that Bunny clearly had his wallet on him when he paid for their cab ride. He's done the same thing to others multiple times. Again, just speaking for myself, I remember thinking after that whole incident, wow, I'm all for killing this guy now. But we should recognize what's going on here. It's a subversion of the audience. It's a subversion of our morality. Tarantino talks about this with the film Joker. The director gets the audience to think like a psychopath, and thus to inhabit the point of view of Joker, who's a crazy character. So true subversion is getting you to think like the character even when that line of thinking violates your own moral code. In the same way that in that film, Murray, the asshole comedian, as Tarantino describes him, the talk show host, he does not deserve to die under any reasonable code of morality. Similarly, Bunny Corcoran clearly doesn't deserve to be murdered because he tricked his friends into paying for his meal at a nice restaurant or because he's a gossip. But by making Bunny so unlikable, within the world of fiction at least, he becomes more killable. And we, as the audience, having learned in the first page that this is a story about Bunny's murder, in some way begin to wish for the murder to happen. We would be disappointed if it somehow didn't happen. And this is even before we learn the actual motivations behind Bunny's murder. It's as if we, as the audience, have become seduced by that same aesthetic dream that Richard wants, and we immediately recognize Bunny as a threat to it. He's so ordinary, so obnoxious, so petty and flawed in many ways. As the story continues, Richard grows to hate Bunny more and more. He says by stages he came to abhor him. Bunny is the kind of person who zeroes in on any insecurity almost with like a sixth sense for it, and he presses into it like a bruise. He grills Richard on where he went to prep school in one incident, and even the other aristocratic members of the inner circle clearly are uncomfortable with Bunny's interrogation of Richard. Henry even intervenes to sort of advocate for Richard. He says, Bunny is saying, "Why aren't you in the yearbook of the prep school you claim to have attended?" And Henry interjects to say, "Well, how do you know whether he's in the yearbook or not?" And it's ironic because Bunny is positioning himself as sort of a gatekeeper within the elite ranks in a way, but we later learn the other members of the group have perhaps the least respect for Bunny and his family as a member of the so-called elite. If anyone other than Richard in their group is the false aristocrat, so to speak, it's Bunny, and yet he's the one doing the purity testing, which to me actually completely tracks with normal social dynamics, right? It's that insecurity that makes you want to be the gatekeeper. Another example of this is the way that Bunny ridicules Camila. Richard says that Bunny didn't like women. He didn't enjoy their company. Quote, "To the rest of us he complained that Camila was out of her league," end quote. And yet Bunny is the worst student of the entire group. He puts together slapdash essays with half-remembered facts from a 6-volume book that he had as a child that detailed the lives of eminent thinkers. He turns in papers that are triple-spaced. He lets Henry copy his work with his superior penmanship, and so on. Bunny is the one who's out of his league. And so Richard tells us, quote, "What was laughable was that poor Bunny should display concern about anyone else's intellectual capacities," end quote. But we have to keep in mind that none of this is the actual motivation for killing Bunny. It's not that he's unlikable. In a way, that's the way we, as the audience, are meant to be seduced by the idea of killing Bunny. The group kills Bunny to keep their secret, the secret of the bacchanalia and the murder that happened during the bacchanalia. That's the nature of the conflict in the story, the keeping of secrets, what it costs to keep a secret, what dangers are involved, what struggles can arise between multiple people charged with keeping the same secret, and so on. It's a secret that binds the group irrevocably together. Their shared killing of Bunny and the consequent necessity for all of them to keep the secret of that deed. But it's also the reason why the group has to be destroyed. The group is also dissolved by that same secret. So it's similar to the theme of Faust, right? Faust is damned by ceaseless striving. Faust is saved by his ceaseless striving. Here, Richard becomes a true member of the group by having a shared secret with all of them. That is how he attains his goal, his aesthetic life, but that life is also destroyed by the same secret. The reason why they want to experience the Dionysian in the first place, the reason why they have the thought of having a bacchanalia, is that they are effectively seduced into the idea by the lectures of Julian. Tartt describes Julian's way of lecturing, quote, "He was a marvelous talker, a magical talker, and I wish I were able to give a better idea of what he said, but it is impossible for a mediocre intellect to render the speech of a superior one." End quote. From the minute that Julian walks into the classroom, he commands everyone's attention. Julian begins his lectures as he always does, quote, "I hope we are all ready to leave the phenomenal world and enter into the sublime." End quote. This is a very interesting way for Julian to begin because the start of the lecture is the establishment of that division between phenomena and noumena. Or to put it into language which is less Kantian and more Platonic, the world of the senses versus the intelligible world, which is accessible only to the philosopher. Richard says that the lecture begins, the first lecture, with a discussion of Plato's four divine madnesses. This is a concept from the Phaedrus, one of the shorter Platonic dialogues, unique in many ways, and similar to the Symposium in that it's a discourse on love, although the Phaedrus is also focused on rhetoric. The four divine madnesses are raised by Socrates as examples of madness which are not the result of human infirmity, but the release of man from the yoke of convention granted by the gods. Socrates says in that dialogue, quote, "The divine madness was subdivided into four kinds: prophetic, initiatory, poetic, erotic, having four gods presiding over them. The first was the inspiration of Apollo, the second that of Dionysus, the third that of the Muses, the fourth that of Aphrodite and Eros." End quote. If we remember from the dialogue in Ion, that's where Socrates goes after the poets by suggesting that their gift is not a talent, it's not an art that's developed through practice or technique, it's a divine madness from the Muses. That theme is repeated here. Poetry is a gift from the gods, a gift that is akin to going out of one's right mind. So in the Phaedrus, Socrates gives Dionysian madness its due, perhaps surprisingly, as a divine gift, which we benefit from. And I think this is a hint in the secret history of the strange reconciliation between Plato and Nietzsche that occurs in this novel. The image of the Greeks that is formed by the students is simultaneously that of the Platonic philosopher and the Dionysian reveler. And Julian goes on to make an argument that resembles some of what Nietzsche has to say in some respects. He says that the Romans were too logical, too orderly in their thought, that they discounted the irrational, the chaotic, the superstitious at their own peril. He brings up the example of Tiberius and the, quote, "tremendous, impossible strain he must have undergone, following in the footsteps of a savior, a god," end quote, of course referring there to Augustus. And further, he says to think of his Julio-Claudian successors, Caligula and Nero, quote, "The Roman genius, and perhaps the Roman flaw, was an obsession with order. One sees it in their architecture, their literature, their laws, this fierce denial of darkness, unreason, chaos." He laughed. Easy to see why the Romans, usually so tolerant of foreign religions, persecuted the Christians mercilessly. How absurd to think a common criminal rose from the dead. How appalling that his followers celebrated him by drinking his blood. The illogic of it frightened them, and they did everything they could to crush it. In fact, I think the reason they took such drastic steps was because they were not only frightened but also terribly attracted to it. Pragmatists are often strangely superstitious, for all their logic, who lived in more abject terror of the supernatural than the Romans. End quote. Julian's lecture has a psychological dimension, and we should remember the connection he draws between psychology and fate. He also uses the language of repression and of channeling primitive impulses, and he advances the argument as Nietzsche does, that the Greeks were different from the Romans in this respect. As Nietzsche would have put it, they had festivals and rituals to accommodate their all-too-human. That is to say, the part of man which is still beast. Quote, "The Greeks, you know, really weren't very different from us. They were a very formal people, extraordinarily civilized, rather repressed. And yet they were frequently swept away en masse by the wildest enthusiasms, dancing, frenzies, slaughter, visions, which for us, I suppose, would seem clinical madness, irreversible. Yet the Greeks, some of them anyway, could go in and out of this as they pleased." End quote. So he would be speaking there, for example, of the Pythia, the Sibyls, the wise initiates and prophets who could enter into a kind of dissolution of the ordinary personality and experience the altered reality of communion with a kind of divine madness. There are a few other philosophical threads in this lecture that I think are worth considering, especially given the episode we did on the Oresteia. Julian describes the Furies as a force that drives people mad because they, quote, "turned up the volume of the inner monologue. Magnified qualities already present to a great excess made people so much themselves that they couldn't stand it." End quote. And this is actually a common interpretation of the psychological or philosophical significance of the Furies as characters, that the Furies in some sense represent the voice of guilt, the voice of conscience, the inner thoughts of the person who has committed the crime. And so their hounding of their victims effectively represents an imposition of the self on the guilty party, insofar as they become unable to forget what I am, what I have done, the continuity of actions, and the continuity of the subject that constitutes the persona. And so Julian has deftly described self-consciousness as a kind of curse, and self-forgetting within Dionysian frenzy as a desirable release. And Julian asks, where can we moderns forget the conscious self? He offers love and war as possibilities, but he says that love is a cruel and terrible master. That is not all it's cracked up to be, and there are no noble causes to fight and die for any longer. Julian then says that Camila read for the part of Clytemnestra when they covered the Oresteia in their class, and he asks her to remember some of the lines from it. She says, in Greek, quote, "Thus he died, and all the life struggled out of him. And as he died, he spattered me with the dark red and violent driven rain of bitter savored blood to make me glad, as gardens stand among the showers of God in glory at the birth time of the buds." End quote. So that's from Clytemnestra's speech celebrating the murder of Agamemnon. And Julian asks, why is this passage so beautiful? Why does it move us? Francis and Charles suggest that the language, the rhythm, the terza rima, but Julian says plenty of passages in Greek are written in this way. And ultimately, Henry offers the insight that Julian elaborates upon. As Aristotle says in his Poetics, quote, "Objects such as corpses, painful to view in themselves, can become delightful to contemplate in works of art." End quote. And from this, we get one of the more famous ideas that most people remember from The Secret History. What is beauty? Terror. Julian says, quote, "Beauty is rarely soft and conciliatory. Quite the contrary. Genuine beauty is always quite alarming." End quote. And there's something very important for Richard's arc in this, and that we can notice the way in which Julian might be warning Richard, not directly, but Richard should take this as a warning that his quest for a beautiful life, his stumbling around the campus drunk with beauty, might be, we might say, the pitfall of one of those romantics from the classical age, who ends up becoming a failed philologist because he didn't really understand the Greeks, because what he was actually looking for was a sort of rapture into romantic placidity. That's what Richard is expecting to find in Hampton. And instead, what does he find in his pursuit of beauty? He finds terror. He gets sucked down, as Oedipus does, into this bewildering vortex of crime. And so, in this novel that is, in many ways, fundamentally about aesthetics, and with a main character who's driven by aesthetics, he's receiving the warning that what he's actually seeking is something rather terrifying. And tellingly, he looks over at Camila at this moment. We really get the sense that Richard is already beginning to fall for Camila, or at least for the idea of Camila. He says, quote, "I looked at Camila, her face bright in the sun, and thought of that line from the Iliad I love so much about Pallas Athene and the terrible eyes shining. And if beauty is terror, said Julian, then what is desire? We think we have many desires, but in fact we have only one. What is it?" "To live," said Camila. "To live forever," said Bunny, chin cupped in palm. End quote. And I should just say, as a personal note, it was a great difficulty for me in trying to decide how I was going to cover this text for an episode, because it's laden with meaning in so many scenes and you'll discover new meanings to little moments that happen as you embark on subsequent readings. So there are just so many subtle moments of characterization and foreshadowing in this scene that it's impossible to take note of them all. So we see over the course of this scene, Henry has the greatest command of the material. He's ever the leader of the group. We see that Richard is still an outsider. He offers little to the discussion. He's mostly sort of in a daze. He's dazed by the lecture, by the strange and dangerous ideas presented to him. He's absorbed in the aesthetics of it rather than really contemplating the meaning, which should be a warning to him. And we see in these last lines, Camila expresses a genuinely Greek understanding of that one desire of mankind, to live. As Nietzsche would have said, liveliness is the goal, not eternal life. But what does Bunny say? The goal is to live forever. So her emphasis is on the living, his is on the duration. Now, that's still an idea one can find in the Greek. I mean, for example, in the Symposium, that there's a will to live on through one's descendants or through one's work and legacy, and that's what drives human beings. And the characters sort of will toast to the idea of living forever later. But I get a very different sense from Bunny adding forever onto the sentiment that Camila already expressed here in this scene. This is where Nietzsche would have said there's something higher at work in rarer, more extraordinary types of people, which is more akin to the will to power than the will to live. It's not the duration of one's experience, but the intensity. It's not an accumulation, but a discharge. And this is what Julian is effectively seducing the students to seek after. And notice he's asked, where can we find such a release from ordinary, modern, mundane life? Where can we find a release from self-consciousness and its burdens? It's not in love, it's not in war, it's in the beauty of death. That is, if you pay attention to the way he leads them down this path, many have argued Julian is in fact consciously manipulating these students, hoping that they'll do exactly what they end up doing in this novel, and I think there's a lot to that idea. And what Richard does think of in relation to all of this is the bakai. Quote, "A play whose violence and savagery made me uneasy, as did the sadism of the bloodthirsty god. Compared to the other tragedies, which were dominated by recognizable principles of justice, no matter how harsh, it was a triumph of barbarism over reason. Dark, chaotic, inexplicable." End quote. And, as we talked about a little bit, or we touched on it when we discussed the bakai, the meta element of the bakai is the way in which it's a tragedy that celebrates tragedy. And in a sense, it acts as an allegory for the power and the magic of tragedy, the power to transmute the ugly, the horrifying, the violent, and so on, into something transcendent, something beautiful. Remember that the desire of Pentheus is to watch. He wants to become a spectator, to see, to voyeuristically experience the Dionysian mystery by watching the bacchantes on Mount Kithaeron. And that's what Dionysus says, I'll help you to do this. And in the course of trusting Dionysus and letting Dionysus be his guide up to the mountain, Pentheus is literally ripped apart. To Richard, the bakai is inexplicable because it seems to have no justice to it. Perhaps the way the Oresteia would seem to have a sense of justice to it, or is like a struggle towards an understanding of justice. In the bakai, Dionysus is capricious, jealous, and destructive. It seems to be a triumph of barbarism because the Dionysian is barbaric. It's a break in the order of civilization and a loss of self. But as we've read in the passages from Julian's lecture, Julian argues that, actually, this is the great genius of the Greeks. Their difference from the Romans. Perhaps their difference from all other peoples, especially from us. They were like us in so many ways. In a word, they were civilized. And yet, they allowed a place for the barbaric. They allowed a place for the irrational and the chaotic. That was their answer to the problem of repression, to the burden of self and the oppressive nature of sanity. Julian concludes the lecture with perhaps the most famous passage from The Secret History. And I simply could not do this episode without reading this passage. Quote, "The Greeks were different. They had a passion for order and symmetry, much like the Romans, but they knew how foolish it was to deny the unseen world, the old gods. Emotion, darkness, barbarism." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, his face almost troubled. "Do you remember what we were speaking of earlier, of how bloody, terrible things are sometimes the most beautiful?" he said. "It's a very Greek idea, and a very profound one. Beauty is terror. Whatever we call beautiful, we quiver before it. And what could be more terrifying and beautiful to souls like the Greeks or our own than to lose control completely, to throw off the chains of being for an instant, to shatter the accident of our mortal selves? Euripides speaks of the Maenads, head thrown back, throat to the stars, more like deer than human being. To be absolutely free. One is quite capable, of course, of working out these destructive passions in more vulgar and less efficient ways. But how glorious to release them in a single burst! To sing, to scream, to dance barefoot in the woods in the dead of night with no more awareness of mortality than an animal. These are powerful mysteries. The bellowing of bulls, springs of honey bubbling up from the ground. If we are strong enough in our souls, we can rip away the veil and look that naked, terrible beauty right in the face. Let God consume us, devour us, unstring our bones, then spit us out reborn. We were all leaning forward, motionless. My mouth had fallen open. I was aware of every breath I took. And that, to me, is the terrible seduction of Dionysiac ritual. Hard for us to imagine. That fire of pure being." End quote. So it is Julian who sows the seeds of the idea, the seductive notion of reaching the pinnacle of divine madness by throwing away oneself in a great burst of dissolution. But for the rest of the novel, Julian occupies a kind of background presence. We don't get the impression that he's actively sort of whispering into their ears about what they should do next. It's the idea itself and the magic, the charisma with which he presents these ideas. He sort of sets them on their course and then is in a way just sort of in the background, almost watching or commenting on what's happening. And I'll get into more of what I mean as we go on. But Julian also foreshadows something interesting in some of the language he uses at the end of the passage we just read. If we are strong enough in our souls, we can rip away the veil and look at that terrible beauty in the face. If this encounter, as he describes it, is nothing less than the divine consuming you and destroying you, spitting you out reborn. So the most profound self-transformation, a total destruction of the old self and a total rebirth. And he likens it to being tempered in the, quote, fire of pure being, end quote. Now, my interpretation of this story is that all of the characters experience the Dionysian, or all five, the four bacchantes and Richard, all experience it. Even though Richard doesn't participate in the bacchanalia, he doesn't even know about it until after the fact. He has his own tempering fire. And this is because I would argue that the bacchanalia by itself is not the essence of the Dionysian, but rather its appearance, at least insofar as the role it plays in the story and the way that it's related to us. So as readers, we only experience the bacchanalia as a second-hand account. Richard isn't there, so we aren't there. It's not our encounter with the Dionysian. What happens to Richard, in fact, is that in an Apollinian attempt at self-creation, trying to weave this dream of being part of this clique of aristocrats in this beautiful place where they can withdraw from the world and be Epicurean philosophers, so on and so forth, that is all very Apollonian. He is actively creating a dream image. Remember that Apollo is the god of dreams. He is also a god of illusions, just in an opposite sense to Dionysus. So it's a very self-constructive and self-representing a creation of one's self-image is the Apollonian. And in so doing, he is pushed by that very same token into a Dionysian act of self-destruction. Not by his own intentions, but this is the kind of strange relationship between Apollo and Dionysus. They are mutually exclusive, and yet one can lead you to the other, or they can contain aspects of the other. And so the Dionysian in the novel it's exactly as Julian describes, the fire of pure being that strips away everything false, makes our true nature draw its ultimate consequences. The Dionysian is a transformative confrontation with the terror and beauty of existence, all at once, in which we are forced to become who we are or perish. My argument would be that for Richard, it is the murder of Bunny that is his Dionysian experience. In Nietzschean terms, the group does something which is beyond good and evil. By committing this act, they quite literally look death in the face. Richard talks about how traumatizing it is looking at Bunny's sort of the frozen last expression of horror and surprise on his face as he studies his corpse right after they kill him. But more importantly, they become immoralists. They set themselves apart from the rest of the world by this act. Richard may not have participated in the bacchanalia, but he experiences that intermingling of beauty and terror in the Dionysian experience of this murder, of this return of darkness, irrationality, and savagery. It's a barbaric excess undertaken for the purposes of maintaining his aesthetic fiction. So it's completely beyond morality. We should think of the distinction between appearance and essence that begins Julian's lecture. Obviously, Nietzsche was very much opposed to that distinction when it was made into metaphysics. But on a psychological level, Nietzsche would fully agree with that distinction. What we appear to be, our conscious image of ourselves, is a superficial skin. The outward ego is a thin veneer on an unknown text, which the real text is the chaotic royal of the unconscious. Richard, for example, is very obviously not what he appears to be. He's an actor. He's a false aristocrat. But as we learn throughout the story, none of them are quite what they appear to be. None of them really match the image that Richard formed of them when watching them from a distance. And this only comes out when they're all put through the fire. The false appearance burns away, and their essence and appearance become unified, so to speak. That's why it's a fire of pure being. Our fictions about ourselves are destroyed, so Richard sees all of his friends for who they truly are by the end of the story. He sees Charles, who appeared charming and respectable, be revealed for an abusive, controlling narcissist who has committed incest. Francis, who seemed confident and aristocratic, is really fearful and helpless, and by the end of the novel, he attempts suicide. Camila, who appeared to be wholesome and innocent, is also revealed to be involved in incest and is also a skilled liar and very manipulative. And Richard, in terms of his own personal journey of self-discovery, realizes, I think, finally, what he was told during this lecture near the beginning of the novel, that his pursuit of beauty is inherently a terrifying thing. I want to go into a bit more detail about the metaphysical, though, as a parallel for the themes of truth and appearance in the novel. Of course, we have Julian always beginning his lectures with, "Are we ready to leave the phenomenal world and enter the sublime?" When Richard returns from a dinner with the twins at their apartment, a dinner with them and the other classic students, he tells us, quote, "When I got to my room, it was silver and alien with moonlight, the window still open, and the Parmenides open on the desk where I had left it. A half-drunk coffee from the snack bar stood beside it, cold in its styrofoam cup. The room was chilly, but I didn't shut the window. Instead, I lay down on my bed, without taking off my shoes, without turning on the light. As I lay on my side, staring at a pool of white moonlight on the wooden floor, a gust of wind blew the curtains out, long and pale as ghosts. As though an invisible hand were leading through them, the pages of the Parmenides rippled back and forth. End quote. So there are subtle hints here. I mean, if we look at the imagery, we have the imagery of stillness, the half-drunk cup of coffee. It's like a kind of frozen image of life, sitting there, cold. Remember how Nietzsche describes Parmenides. He was a man who presents a vision of being as still and frozen. Parmenides argued that motion, and therefore change, is all an illusion, that pure being would be unchangeable, eternal, set into stone, so to speak. At the end of the scene, there is the illusion that an invisible hand is flipping through the pages. That's just a mere appearance given by the wind. That was the argument of Parmenides, so to speak. The world as it appears is not at all what it is. That logically speaking, what is what is, not what will be or what was. What exists is only what is. Therefore, what is all there is. And that could never change. That line of thinking was influential on Plato, and Plato's philosophy in some sense is a response to Parmenides that attempts to reconcile his pure theory of being with the fact that there does seem to be a world of appearances and sensations. And thus there must be some reason as to why we don't experience being as it really is. Why the illusion? Plato deals with this by means of his theory of the forms. The forms, or the ideas, are what is really real, and phenomenal reality is a kind of vulgar, crude, lesser reality, like the shadows cast on the wall of the cave. And so, from the Nietzschean standpoint, if we really onboard a lot of Nietzsche's understanding or interpretation of the Greek world, you could say that Donna Tartt is presenting a Dionysus that's perhaps a bit too metaphysical from Nietzsche's point of view. But I would simply say that the version of Dionysus that is presented here is not too far off from the one that the young Nietzsche put forward in Birth of Tragedy, for example, when he's still influenced by the metaphysical thinking of Schopenhauer. The Dionysian return to the primordial essence of being represents in that text an experience with the true world. It is to rip away the veil of Maya, behold the naked, pure beauty of reality, which means to behold pure terror, since, as Rilke puts it, in words that Julian echoes, beauty is just the beginning of terror. So, in any case, it's that version of Dionysus, in Birth of Tragedy, that seems most similar to the Dionysus that Julian seduces the students with. And I mentioned that this could be a conscious manipulation, and there are several indications of the amorality or immorality of Julian and of the other classic students that Richard becomes enamored with. I mean, a girl that Richard meets at a party tells him that he should be careful around those Greek students because, quote, they worship the fucking devil, end quote. And that's the kind of half-true rumor that we might expect to surround a group of students devoted to Dionysus. The associations with wine and sex and madness and all these things, and his horned appearance that's often led the Christian world to associate Dionysus with Satan. And of course, Dionysus is the opponent of Christ in the Nietzschean framework. We see this anti-Christian aspect in Julian as well. Richard says that if pressed, Julian would protest that he of course loves Dante as one of the greatest poets of the European canon, but that in truth he did seem to harbor a kind of antipathy towards Christianity, that he sees it as Pliny did, as a superstitious cult. And in the scene at Bunny's funeral, Richard notes that Julian has a pagan's gloomy view of death, and felt quite alienated by the passages from the Bible that were chosen for the reading. Now, in order to actually undertake the bacchanalia, the group tries all sorts of different things. They try to emulate the techniques of the Pythia, they try drunkenness, drugs, even mild poisoning, but nothing works. And as Henry later explains, he came to realize that all of these attempts were misguided. He says, quote, "What we were missing was something in all likelihood quite simple, which it was. And what might that have been? Only this. To receive the God in this or any other mystery, one has to be in a state of euphemia, cultic purity. That is at the very center of Bacchic mystery. Even Plato speaks of it. Before the divine can take over, the mortal self, the dust of us, the part that decays, must be made as clean as possible. How is that? Through symbolic acts, most of them fairly universal in the Greek world, water poured over the head, baths, fasting. Bunny wasn't so good about the fasting, nor the baths either, if you ask me, but the rest of us went through the motions. The more we did it, though, the more meaningless it all began to seem, until one day I was struck by something rather obvious. Namely, that any religious ritual is arbitrary unless one is able to see past it to a deeper meaning. He paused. "Do you know," he said, "what Julian says about the Divine Comedy?" "No, Henry, I don't." "That it's incomprehensible to someone who isn't a Christian. That if one is to read Dante and understand him, one must become a Christian, if only for a few hours. It was the same with this. It had to be approached on its own terms, not in a voyeuristic light or even a scholarly one. At the first, I suppose, it was impossible to see it any other way, looking at it as we did in fragments through centuries. The vitality of the act was entirely obfuscated, the beauty, the terror, the sacrifice." He took one last drag of his cigarette and put it out. "Quite simply," he said, "we didn't believe. And belief was the one condition which was absolutely necessary. Belief and absolute surrender." End quote. This is why, even though they tried to include Bunny in their early attempts, they eventually succeed in the Bacchanal only when he's not there. Bunny would always make some silly joke or mess things up in some way out of a lack of seriousness, a lack of belief. Bunny also displays the same lack of seriousness while they're in their classes. During an intense and engaging moment in the lecture, Bunny will interject some comment that brings us back down to earth, back down to ordinary, small, average modernity. For example, when the students are fantasizing about using their knowledge of Xenophon and Thucydides to take over Hampton in a military campaign, they imagine the tributes that will be brought to them. The other students say, "They'll bring us gold and peacocks and ivory." And Bunny takes the opportunity to make some joke about the tributes consisting actually of cheddar cheese and common crackers, a remark that seems to bother even Julian. In short, Bunny is too modern, he's too cynical, he's short-sighted, he's willing to exploit his friends for his own financial gain. He's the kind of person who has absorbed the unserious, witty, ironical way of being that doesn't really reckon with the numinous. And as Henry reports, it was only by excluding him that they actually succeed. And when Richard asks Henry what happened during the bacchanalia, Henry says that they're called mysteries for a reason. If you don't have the experience, it can't really be described. He does attempt to explain what happened, but we have to keep in mind that this description is not itself the Dionysian. It's a representation. It's second-hand. It's actually third-hand, because Richard's unreliable recollection of what Henry told him is what we're actually reading. And I think this is necessary, because if the Dionysian were actually experienced by the protagonist, we might mistake his feeble attempt to narrate the experience in the written word as actually being the essence of the Dionysian, when, in fact, no amount of facsimile or representation or describing it in words could ever get it across. So instead, it's told to the protagonist as a story, with, some images, some allegory, some contradictory narratives as to what exactly happened. So that makes us aware that we could never render such a thing onto the page, that we're not cognizing the noumenon here. We're only ever grasping at a representation. This is how Henry attempts to describe it. Quote, "It was heart-shaking, glorious, torches, dizziness, singing, wolves howling around us and a bull bellowing in the dark. The river ran white. It was like a film in fast motion, the moon waxing and waning, clouds rushing across the sky. Vines grew from the ground so fast they twisted up the trees like snakes, seasons passing in the wink of an eye, entire years for all I know. I mean, we think of phenomenal change as being the very essence of time, when it's not at all. Time is something which defies spring and winter, birth and decay, the good and the bad, indifferently. Something changeless and joyous and absolutely indestructible. Duality ceases to exist. There is no ego, no I, and yet it's not at all like those horrid comparisons one sometimes hears in Eastern religions, the self being a drop of water swallowed by the ocean of the universe. It's more as if the universe expands to fill the boundaries of the self. You have no idea how pallid the workday boundaries of ordinary existence seem after such an ecstasy. It was like being a baby. I couldn't remember my name. The soles of my feet were cut to pieces, and I couldn't even feel it." End quote. And, throughout the rest of the story, none of the Bacchantes really want to talk much about this. They had to tell Richard about the experience to bring him into their plot, but they know the experience is beyond words. It's an experience that Richard doesn't have, and this is another way in which Richard remains sort of eternally an outsider, an observer, an actor throughout the entire story. He doesn't have the mystical experience to really be part of their cult, an experience that binds the four of them together in a way they're not really bound with Richard. And so again, there are these cynical interpretations of the secret history that they simply want to use Richard. That when Henry tells, of their murder during the bacchanalia to Richard, or the accidental slaying that happens during the bacchanalia, and then brings him into the plan to kill Bunny. He outright tells Richard that they were worried Bunny was going to tell him, and so perhaps they were simply worried that Bunny was going to tell Richard anyway, and then they know they could maneuver Richard into joining with them. If Bunny tells Richard what happens before Henry tells him, Richard might have thought of it as a betrayal and gone against the group and gone with Bunny. But I don't think this quite holds up. So, for one, Henry knows that Richard found out about their plans to flee to Argentina, leaving both him and Bunny behind. And yet Richard says nothing, and he remains loyal to the group. So, and this was experienced as a betrayal by Richard, by the way. So he is, to put it very bluntly, sycophantic. He wants the affection and the friendship of the group. And if Bunny had gone to Richard first, he might have still decided to help Henry and the gang murder him, because really, as he said, he had come to abhor Bunny by stages, and he's willing to do anything for his aesthetic dream. And I think Henry's smart enough to know that. And we should also take note that the group doesn't really need Richard's help. They wanted his help. The very fact that Henry saved Richard's life when he almost froze to death spending winter break in an unheated warehouse, that shouldn't be overlooked. If Henry's sole concern was that Bunny might tell Richard and he wanted to manipulate Richard in some way, well, he could have just let Richard freeze to death, right? Henry, as we later learn, basically discovers that he is probably what normal society would call a psychopath, willing to take the lives of those in his way without much moral compunction about it, if any. When Francis is fretting about the idea of committing a cold-blooded murder, Henry lights a cigarette and says, quote, "I prefer to think of it as a redistribution of matter," end quote. So if Richard was simply a liability, letting him die is not outside the realm of possibility for Henry. And once again, they don't really need Richard to kill Bunny. When the moment comes to commit the murder, Henry is the only one who really does anything. He does the dirty work basically by himself. The rest of them just sort of surround Bunny. So I think, again, the idea that the Bacchantes don't really care at all about Richard is a little too easy and a little too convenient. It means we can just sort of file the character's motivations in a neat box and not have to think about it too hard. Real life is more complicated, and again, friendship is not always equal, and Richard is sycophantic and almost pathetic in some ways. But that is true to life, and every friend group I've been in, you can detect that informal hierarchy that forms. It's usually fluid rather than static. There's, usually all sorts of nuance to it, but it's almost always there. Social status is the reality. There are leaders and followers, stars and sycophants. That's the reality of human life. And Richard is a follower. Henry is the leader. And the other thing is that there are hints throughout the story that the group sees through Richard's act. I would say, at the moment when Richard almost freezes to death, staying in the warehouse over winter break, I would say that Henry has completely figured out that Richard isn't all he says he is. And Bunny, in his way, is also a kind of an imposter. He is the opposite of an aristocrat of the spirit. He's a plebeian who happens to come from money. I would say that that's a justified interpretation of how the rest of the group sees Bunny. Is Richard's opposite, basically. That we get this indication when Henry describes how Bunny's family sent him to the nicest school but gives him no money to support himself, which, quote, has inculcated in Bunny the notion that it's more honorable to live by sponging off other people than it is to work, end quote. So he says his family, the Corcorans, have delusions of grandeur, that they're thinking of themselves as aristocratic and grand, quote, farming their sons off to other people, end quote, is completely absurd. For Henry's part, he says, quote, it's unthinkable. I'd rather have any job, 6 jobs, than beg from people, end quote. And he then addresses Richard, quote, look at you. Your parents aren't particularly generous with you, are they? But you're so scrupulous about not borrowing money that it's rather silly. Heavens, I think you would have died in that warehouse than wire one of us for a couple of $100, end quote. So, aside from, Nietzsche's view about leisure as being the purview of the aristocrat, Henry expresses that there's something loathsome about begging for your money, being dependent on others. And in spite of Henry's chiding him, we can tell he respects Richard for his scrupulousness, as he puts it. And I think, given the way that the group, like when Bunny was trying to expose Richard for being a false aristocrat per se, and the rest of the group didn't condone that behavior, part of being an aristocrat is being able to maintain appearances, maintain etiquette, maintain the social niceties. And I think the subtext of that whole interaction with Richard is that Henry is completely aware that Richard is a commoner. Again, I'm using sort of titles of nobility versus commoners as a shorthand, even though this isn't a literal reality of a class system, but you know what I mean. He knows Richard's a commoner. He's not going to say it. He's basically saying, your parents aren't particularly generous with you. That's a nice way of saying, look, I know your parents don't have any money, but look at how you comport yourself. It's far more respectable than Bunny, whose parents have a ton of money, but who goes through life sponging off other people. And so there's a way in which it's almost like they're replacing Bunny with Richard in their sort of social hierarchy. They are willing to part with Bunny as a false aristocrat and accept in Richard, who's like the actor of an aristocrat. Now, we've talked a great deal about the characters not being all that they seem, and this is certainly no less true of Julian. And one of the first things Julian says to Richard is to repeat a Greek aphorism that honesty is a dangerous virtue. He is sort of avowedly not what he seems. And the signals from Tartt on Julian's significance are numerous. And there is an argument that Julian can be interpreted as Dionysus himself, which I think is interesting to think about, even if it's a bit of an interpretive stretch. Especially when we consider the influence of the bakai in the text, a play in which Dionysus walks among the main characters in human form, and even though he seems to warp reality wherever he goes, the maenads themselves don't know that he is the god himself. They think he's just a priest of Dionysus from the east. I'd like to consider the first scene that takes place in Julian's office, where it's described in a way that is very tropical in the Nietzschean sense of the word. And what do I mean by that? In Beyond Good and Evil, 197, Nietzsche writes, quote, we fundamentally misunderstand predatory animals and predatory men, for example, Cesare Borgia, and we misunderstand nature, so long as we still look for a pathology at the bottom of these healthiest of all tropical monsters and growths, or even for some hell born in them, as almost all moralists so far have done. It seems that among moralists there is a hatred for the primeval forest and the tropics, and that the tropical man must at any price be discredited, whether as a sickness and degeneration of human beings, or as his own hell and self-torture. But why? For the benefit of the moderate zones? For the benefit of the moderate human beings? For the moral human beings? For the mediocre? End quote. Now listen to how Julian's office is described. Quote, there were flowers everywhere, roses and carnations and anemones on his desk, on the table, in the windowsills. The roses were especially fragrant. Their smell hung rich and heavy in the air, mingled with the smell of bergamot and black china tea and the faint, inky scent of camphor. Breathing deep, I felt intoxication. Everywhere I looked was something beautiful. Oriental rugs, porcelains, tiny paintings like jewels, end quote. And further in the book, quote, Julian's classes met in his office. He had a theory that pupils learned better in a pleasant, non-scholastic atmosphere, and that luxurious hothouse of a room, flowers everywhere in the dead of winter, was some sort of Platonic microcosm of what he thought a schoolroom should be. Work, he said to me once, astonished when I referred to our classroom activities as such. Do you really think what we do is work? What else should I call it? I should call it the most glorious kind of play, end quote. So this is not an academic classroom. It's a place full of living, growing things. It's not a place for work, which is to say labor, preparation for the modern workforce, which is what most of higher education is. It's a place of play. It's within this luxurious hothouse, as she describes it. So it's a jungle maintained indoors against the natural elements of winter outside. It's a tropical setting in which this idea takes hold in our main characters. And notice also the scents and the images from the East, similarly to how Dionysus comes to Thebes with an Asian chorus of bacchae and the garb of an Eastern priest. And one of the things Pentheus comments on are the stranger's curls and the fragrances he must wear to seduce women. Pentheus says, it's really Aphrodite at work here. In other words, it's lust. And I think that's what's being conjured with Julian. Richard feels intoxicated in his very tropical office. His lyceum is a Platonic microcosm, a mini republic. And so it's therefore hierarchical, or he's a preacher of the aristocracy in some sense. All classrooms are, but Julian has these aristocratic sensibilities. He celebrates this element. He's rumored to have connections with Franco's Spain, to have tutored a princess from a fictional country, which is obviously supposed to be Iran. After Salman Rushdie, I guess we can understand why Tartt might not want to mention the Iranians by name at all. But he's in with all the elites. And Hampton, again, is a college for the elites. I mean, they mention one of the hotels is where FDR used to stay, for example. Just little hints like that. Another interesting aspect of Julian's character is how often he seems to be playing a role, and even transparently so. Sometimes his dialogue and his actions almost appear acted. Let me give you an example. So when Bunny goes missing and the group finally tells Julian that they haven't seen him in a few days, quote, Julian's eyes widened with childish theatrical surprise. Not for the first time, I thought how much he was like Henry, and the strange mixture of chill and warmth. Indeed, he said, most peculiar. And you have no idea where he might be? The mischievous open-ended note in his voice made me nervous. He knows, I thought, with a rush of panic. He knows we're lying. He just doesn't know what we're lying about. End quote. And so, like Dionysus and the Bacchae, does Julian know more than he's letting on? We might even wonder, is he toying with his students, in full knowledge of what they've done? Is he enjoying this as a spectacle? When the police and search parties are fanning out across the landscape, searching for Bunny, Julian remarks that it's something out of a novel by Tolstoy. The grand scale of it all. He seems to be enjoying the aesthetics of the event. And after they return to classes, following Bunny's funeral, Julian makes a remark then about how he's like quoting from Horace, saying about how meat is good for grieving. And Richard says it was Julian's Socratic detachment that made it so that he was never terribly happy or sad about anything for long. After a short while, he's once again beginning class with the question, are we ready to leave the phenomenal world behind and enter the sublime? So he seems unfazed by the whole thing, even entertained by it, and he moves on from it very quickly. And so if you read Julian this way, the ending of the story becomes very interesting. Henry thinks that Julian flees out of cowardice. But if Julian really is like an avatar of Dionysus, perhaps the whole thing was simply the play of this god of madness and illusions. He came to wreak havoc on these students, perhaps not even to arbitrarily punish them, but simply to see whether they were strong enough to endure the Dionysian and to be reborn on the other side. And we might consider the dedication for the second part of the novel, a quote from E.R. Dodds, quote, Dionysus is the master of illusions. who could make a vine grow out of a ship's plank, and in general enable his votaries to see the world as the world's not." End quote. The original title of the work was The Master of Illusions. So perhaps there is something to this interpretation, that there's a hint. Who would the Master of Illusions be, supposing that the work were to be titled that, other than Julian? So even if Julian isn't taken to be literally Dionysus, there would seem to be a god at work here, perhaps working through him. A more materialist reading of the text, a more cynical reading of the character, would be that he truly was just stricken by cowardice at the end. That he can preach the Dionysian, but he flees when he's confronted by the effect, the consequence of teaching the Dionysian to his students. It's one thing to talk about going beyond good and evil, but in seeing the effect that has, one can't justifiably stand by that choice, so to speak. So he flees either out of guilt or out of fear. And in this reading, he would be a similar character to, say, Jimmy Stewart's character in the Hitchcock film Rope. That film was loosely inspired by the Leopold and Loeb killings, and the fact that Leopold and Loeb considered themselves inspired by Nietzsche, although most would say their reading of Nietzsche left something to be desired. But Stewart plays a professor in that film who inspired two young men to see themselves as beyond good and evil, in so many words, entitled to take life if they pleased. And when he discovers that his two students actually did this, actually murdered someone, his character is horrified and he turns them into the police. But again, we don't know. Julian is a mysterious character, and ultimately Henry doesn't have any more information than Richard does as to why Julian disappears at the end. And I think it's more interesting to leave open the possibilities and to treat with the symbolic importance of Julian in the story, regardless of how you literally read the character. That these possibilities for the story exist because it is a story about that difference between truth and appearance, between the phenomenal world and the sublime, between the half that other people don't know, so to speak, the inner life that's going on within you, the motivations that you might not even understand yourself as to why the way you act the way you do, and then what's seen on the surface, and then how we might interpret, we who are external to that inner life, what other characters do and why they do it. And this is no less true for Julian, and I think it would be rather disappointing if, at the end of the story, Julian appeared lowered down from the heavens by the Deus Ex Machina to tell us that at the end of the story that I am Dionysus, son of Zeus, the way that the bakai ends. Now, the fact is that most of these students, as it turns out, whatever Julian's intentions might have been, they did not have any business finding out about the Greeks, to use Nietzsche's language. There is an element of guilt, moral guilt, among the punishments that the main characters endure. It's those same old furies who force us to remember ourselves and what we've done. But I'd argue it's not really a moralistic tale, as the group does not receive a moral punishment. Ultimately, they get away with it. There's no recompense for the murder. And in spite of the fact that, one of their own number, Bunny, is murdered, another one, Henry, kills himself, the four surviving friends get to live out their lives. They're never caught. Richard does not finish the story haunted by his own guilt or driven by the impulse to turn himself in. They don't even seem to recognize any essential immorality in their actions. Henry's reasoning as for why they had to cover up the first murder is that it was an accident. And since there's nothing they can do about it now, well, there's no sense in me spending the rest of my life in a Vermont jail. We can understand that reasoning from the perspective of that self-absorbed pseudo-Nietzschean perspective. Really, I'm a person of far greater value than that man probably was. There's no sense in ruining my valuable life because of the simple mistake of destroying one of these peasants. Again, this is why a lot of people don't like the characters in this book, and I don't think we're supposed to necessarily like them. But remember what we've talked about concerning the master morality. Sometimes the noble harms other people, but they do it thoughtlessly. They don't go about maliciously intending to hurt. It's the slave moralist who thinks there should be some revenge, some justice, that the offending party deserves to suffer and must be made to suffer. So from this perspective, yes, Henry is a model amoralist. He's a throwback to the master morality. He's not concerned with hurting others, but he really doesn't care. Francis, on the other hand, is often fretting about the cold-blooded murder. the moral guilt that they've stained themselves with. And Richard commiserates with Francis in this. He feels that moral guilt also. Richard's intended to be something of an everyman, I think. So as Nietzsche says, like all people who come from higher and complex cultures, like our own, he has both the modern morality and the antica morale within him, the morality of antiquity. But if anything, I would say what Richard is haunted by is the fact that Bunny was his friend. It's more so after his death that Richard tells us that Bunny had charming and redeeming qualities. Quote, "Reading back over this, I feel that in some respects I've done Bunny an injustice. People really did like him. No one had known him all that well, but it was a strange feature of his personality that the less one actually knew him, the more one felt one did." End quote. There's another scene in the first part of the novel when Richard recalls Henry and Bunny playing croquet and laughing together, and tells us how that laugh haunts him to this day. The memory of that laugh, that's, evidence that it was never so simple as Bunny being a complete asshole that nobody liked. Richard had affection for him, and in fact, in his first interaction with the group, it's Bunny who is most enthusiastic to meet him. It's Bunny who suggests that he ask Julian a second time to join the class, and it's Bunny who tells him that they should hang out again. Bunny is more than anyone responsible for Richard getting to join his group of friends. The fact that Bunny is named after an animal that was commonly sacrificed in the ritual context in the ancient world should not escape us either. Bunny is scapegoated. He's the sacrifice of Richard's ethics, someone he had genuine affection for, on the altar of aesthetics. That is the definitive incident for Richard. For the four bacchants, they started out seeking an experience of pure being in the bacchanalia, but Richard doesn't have that experience, and he doesn't really seem to have a desire to have experienced it. He wonders about it, mainly because the bacchanalia is a sex ritual, and he has some issues of jealousy or disgust or curiosity about all of his friends doing it, for lack of a better phrase. But he doesn't seem terribly upset that he missed out on seeing reality melt and he missed out on the wonderful experience of accidentally murdering someone. His concern throughout the text is not to touch that bedrock of metaphysical certainty or have a mystical experience. It's almost like the bacchants are looking for truth and beauty behind the veil, and Richard's always been looking for it in the veil of reality. And in that way, Richard is perhaps more Greek than any of them, and that he remains on the surface. Because what else is a longing for the aesthetic, a longing for the picturesque, other than being superficial? Richard's concerns are superficial. And as Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, quote, "Those Greeks, they knew how to live. What is required for that is to stop courageously at the surface, the fold, the skin, to adore appearance, to believe in forms, tones, words, and the whole Olympus of appearance. Those Greeks were superficial, out of profundity." End quote. And I think that very much describes Richard, and more than that, it describes Donna Tartt, because Richard is in many ways a stand-in for her, and you can just see how this text, the entire book, what I'm not getting across with a philosophical analysis, and I never could, is just the way in which the text luxuriates in these aesthetic descriptions. And it is the aspect that many people, even the ones who don't like the characters, admit is the high point of the book. Tartt is very good at bringing us into a setting, into a moment, showing us those little moments of, beauty within the ordinary, I guess we would say. And that works very much with the character that she's writing. But again, we have this distinction that for Richard, he is not after fundamentally the same thing as the rest of the characters. He's not trying to go beyond or go beneath. He is trying to experience the surface. And it's interesting, therefore, that Richard is the only one who becomes a philologist. He's the only true Hellenist among the group. He's the only one to finish the degree. But to kind of go back to the thread we were following beforehand, the characters don't really fully express moral regret for what they have done. They can rationalize it as self-defense or rationalize it as for the greater good or something like that. And even Richard is somewhat blasé about this. He begins part 2 by saying, quote, "Just for the record, I do not consider myself an evil person. although how like a killer that makes me sound, end quote. And then further down in the passage, quote, what we did was terrible, but I still don't think any of us were bad exactly. Chalk it up to weakness on my part, hubris on Henry's, too much Greek prose composition, whatever you like, end quote. And in fact, Richard references Dostoevsky. He directly quotes Crime and Punishment, quote, it was I killed the old pawnbroker woman and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them, end quote. And that illustrates that Richard is aware of the parallels, as he experiences for a time that kind of guilty conscience that Raskolnikov feels. But after the funeral and after they dodge the investigation, it seems, quite frankly, that he gets over it. And the fact that he draws attention to Dostoevsky's story, in which the message is a moralistic one, and it culminates in the confession of the main character, that should show us by contrast that this isn't the same kind of story. That's what he's drawing attention to. It isn't a sense of moral guilt that Richard carries with him into his life, that, the life that he lives after the event of the novel. It's not Bunny's ghost that haunts him in the very final scene of the novel, but Henry's. Who is Henry, we should ask? Henry, I think, is a true philosopher. He's a true bacchant. Like the Maenads of Dionysus that we've read about in the Bakai, Henry seems to possess almost a superhuman strength. In one anecdote, recounted by Judy, Henry beats up a character that's described as a huge biker, and Richard thinks of this as a funny image. He's an outlaw type in a leather jacket being beaten down by a scholar. Or consider the fact that he's able to put his fist straight through the skull of the Vermont farmer during the bacchanalia. Henry is completely disconnected from the modern world also. He's unaware that the moon landing happened. His idea of the more modern stuff, as he calls it, in terms of literature, are the Athenian tragedians and Plato. The older stuff is Homer. So his world is entirely set apart from the concerns of the average person. And he has some similarities to Nietzsche that I can't help but notice, mainly the crippling headaches, that he has to take drugs in order to merely function and endure. Nietzsche, the similarities are manifest there. He was another erudite, polyglot, gifted philologist, stricken by inescapable physical pain, headaches, nausea, etc. And like Nietzsche, Henry bears these stoically, and he also seems, as we've said, to consider the world amorally. Now, I don't think he's a stand-in for Nietzsche or anything like that. I just think there might be an influence there on the way that he's portrayed. He takes some of the traits, maybe, from Nietzsche. I think that we can interpret Henry as a character who has fully come to understand and know the Greek outlook, or at least thinks he does, and particularly attained the vantage point of the Greek philosopher. He believes he can tell the truth from mere appearance, that he can see the world of sense experience as merely phenomenal. It is after Bunny's murder that he's reading the Upanishads, which was an influence on the work of Schopenhauer, who said that our sensory perception of the world is a mere representation. Henry consequently sees our actions within this world as possessing no moral significance. That's the source of his hubris. It's all just arrangements of matter, as he said. And he now knows, after his Dionysian experience, that there is true being. There's something beyond this world of appearance. He's seen into that world during the Bacchanal, at least presumably. That paradoxical reconciliation between Nietzsche and Plato that I have argued Tartt presents here is sort of embodied by Henry. He attains what every philosopher wishes they could attain, to go beyond the limits of sensation and earthly knowledge in order to glimpse the noumenal. We can only speculate about Henry's suicide, but I think his motivation for doing so can probably be understood by reference to an ancient aphorism. This is how nobility dies, by its own hand. By this point in the story, the secrets are tearing the group apart, and the leader's job is to protect his group, and Henry is undoubtedly their leader. They all look up to Julian as their authority figure, as a father figure, but ultimately it's quite different to be the leader among peers versus a mentor or parent figure, and by this time Julian's long gone. By killing himself, and Henry is the one who committed both the murders, therefore the culprit of those murders is dead, which would relieve at least some of the burden of keeping those secrets. Charles is off the hook for trying to kill Henry or for accidentally shooting Richard. Like a true leader, Henry goes down with the ship. On the other hand, I'm not trying to suggest that he died as a selfless act for others. I don't think that would fit with his character. I think I would describe it as perhaps a suicide out of a sense of duty. Knowing his role and knowing that he can save the group, he feels perhaps obligated as a leader. But I think there's something more going on here. I think that Henry knew that a life awaited him, which was the life of a stranger in a foreign land. I'm reminded of Empedocles, who says he wept when he realized that he was stranded in this foreign land, and what he meant by foreign land was the physical world. Empedocles always felt himself to be a god, a divine being who was merely trapped in mortal form. And among all these ancient cults among the Greeks, there are these ideas of metempsychosis, the transportation of the soul from one body to another. These spiritual movements, launched by the likes of Pythagoras and Empedocles and the Orphics, provided the origins of Greek philosophy, because all of these figures are influential on Plato, who founded the Academy. So there's like that ancient mystical origin to Platonic philosophy. But in any case, Henry, like Empedocles, would have gone through life feeling himself to have been incarnated into the wrong world, so to speak. And thrown into the bargain is he's afflicted with these migraines as part of that existence, and now he's forever burdened by this secret that the group is all bound to keep. And so my interpretation would be that he sees he can protect the group through his death, but he also sees no point in continuing in his life. It's someone who thinks like Bunny, who wants to live forever, who clings to a threadbare existence just for the sake of continuing existing. So Henry lets go of that attachment. He trusts that his body is a thing that exists within an illusory world, and he willingly takes his own life as an act of bravery, a leap into the world beyond. We might also think of the way Socrates faced death with serene indifference. He stated that it was not for the wise man to fear death because death could well be the most beneficial thing to happen to any of us. So a man who's lived virtuously has nothing to fear from death. Or we might think of Xenophon, who said that those who least feared death, who threw themselves into mortal danger, were the ones blessed by the gods. Henry dies on his own terms. A noble suicide is in some sense the obligation of a king facing the downfall of his kingdom, and so he chooses to die in a Greek way to cap off his life with a willful act, rather than slowly die and degenerate, as all the others do, as they linger in a world that they were not made for. Henry, quite literally, leaves the phenomenal world and goes into the sublime. One of the great mysteries of the novel would be, what does Henry whisper to Camila before he dies? And obviously we don't know. But one could make an educated guess. Perhaps he told Camila in whatever words, this is all but a dream, this is a fleeting thing. The noble soul doesn't cling to life. He throws himself into death, asking, was that life once more? I think he probably asked her to come with him. Obviously, he's not going to force her to make that decision, and it wouldn't mean anything if it wasn't voluntary. But Camilla's great tragedy then would be that even though she loves Henry, she isn't able to make the same leap. She can't follow him, for whatever reason, and will now live a sad and frankly pointless life. Richard, at the end of the novel, is actually sort of offering her a hand to pull her out of this depressing conclusion to her story, and she refuses because she's trapped between forever idealizing this man she can't have, because he's really from another world and he doesn't belong in the modern world, and has gone into a voluntary death. But she doesn't measure up to his strength or his bravery. She's not willing to cap off her life with a voluntary death in the truly Greek fashion in the same way. She can't willingly complete her own tragedy. So she's condemned to the long, slow death of old age. It's a life of quiet desperation, which is the fate of so many moderns. So where does that leave Richard? Well, again, he's the only one who becomes a philologist. So there's an argument he's the only true Hellenist among them, because he's the actor who acted the role so successfully that he actually became it. He's the only one who finishes with a degree. And Richard, at the end, he seems to rise above the group hierarchy to become closer to Henry. We have Charles and Francis kind of crack under pressure. One of them's facing legal problems. The other one's teetering on the edge of self-destruction. Richard is shown to be somewhat tougher. And near the last chapters, even though Henry is increasingly withdrawn and he and Camila begin to retreat from the rest of the group, he still confides in Richard in one of the final scenes. He tells him after Julian leaves, quote, "I loved him more than my own father," he said. "I loved him more than anyone in the world," end quote. And he has tears in his eyes. Julian's departure really hurt Henry. And so we have to take all of his ranting about how Julian did it out of cowardice to be the hurt words of a scorned son who feels abandoned by a father figure. It also throws potential light on his suicide. I mean, ultimately, Camila was not the love of his life. That was Julian. And the prospect of a life without Julian is unthinkable to him. But, he tells this to Richard, and we get the sense here as elsewhere that Henry always had a great deal of genuine affection for Richard. And I think that is because he sees something in Richard that is perhaps closest to the Greek spirit, in Richard's steadfastness in his role. Remember, as Nietzsche says, the Greeks are a nation of actors. What is the real tragedy of the novel for Richard, right? What is the bad thing that befalls him? I mean, really, it's only that he doesn't get Camila. To Richard, Camila is almost the idea of a woman more than she is a real woman. She's the Pallas Athene, the embodiment of truth, the good, the beautiful. She's the eternal feminine that lures us to perfection, as Goethe would say. Truth is a woman and loves only a warrior, in Nietzsche's coinage, and Henry was the true warrior in the group. He was the one who acted in the story, most profoundly. He led the group, he arranged everything about the bacchanalia and the murder, he coordinates the group's actions when they're under investigation, he was the true bacchant and the true philosopher, he was the better man. The ideal that Richard looked up to was Henry. And so when he tells Camila, "I loved Henry too," isn't that enough? I mean, she has to think about it, but it's not enough, because Richard might be the actor of the ideal set by Henry, but Henry actually is the ideal. He was so much the ideal that he couldn't even survive the real anymore. Camila falling in love with Richard would be the perfect end to the story for him. It would be the perfect conclusion to his aesthetic dream of how his life should be. In spite of everything that had happened, all the drama and the group falling apart in the later pages of the novel, that would sort of be the compensation for all of that. But that's the tragedy of Richard's story, because at the finale, the conclusion of his attempt to act his way into the role, he fails. He's not Henry. He can't act his way into being Henry. You can act your way into a lot of things. You can act your way into appearing extraordinary. But being genuinely extraordinary isn't an act. And Henry was that. He was genuinely extraordinary. The final scene in the epilogue is Richard's dream, and it's such an incredible scene. It's my favorite scene in the whole novel, so I'm going to read the scene in full, and then I'll give my final thoughts in this lengthy review and discussion. Quote, "I found myself in a strange deserted city. An old city like London, underpopulated by war or disease. It was night. The streets were dark, bombed out, abandoned. For a long time, I wandered aimlessly, past ruined parks, blasted statuary, vacant lots overgrown with weeds, and collapsed apartment houses with rusted girders poking out of their sides like ribs. But here and there, interspersed among the desolate shells of the heavy old public buildings, I began to see new buildings too, which were connected by futuristic walkways lit from beneath. Long, cool perspectives of modern architecture, rising phosphorescent and eerie from the rubble. I went inside one of these new buildings. It was like a laboratory, maybe, or a museum. My footsteps echoed on the tile floors. There was a cluster of men, all smoking pipes, gathered around an exhibit in a glass case that gleamed in the dim light and lit their faces ghoulishly from below. I drew nearer. In the case was a machine revolving slowly on a turntable, a machine with metal parts that slid in and out and collapsed in upon themselves to form new images. An Inca temple, click, 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 the pyramids, the Parthenon, history passing beneath my very eyes, changing every moment. "I thought I'd find you here," said a voice at my elbow. It was Henry. His gaze was steady and impassive in the dim light. Above his ear, beneath the wire stem of his spectacles, I could just make out the powder burn and the dark hole in his right temple. I was glad to see him, though not exactly surprised. "You know," I said to him, "everybody is saying that you're dead." He stared down at the machine. "The Colosseum. Click, click, click. The Pantheon." "I'm not dead," he said. "I'm only having a bit of trouble with my passport." "What?" He cleared his throat. "My movements are restricted," he said. "I no longer have the ability to travel as freely as I would like." Hagia Sophia, St. Mark's in Venice. "What is this place?" I asked him. "That information is classified, I'm afraid." I looked around curiously. It seemed that I was the only visitor. "Is it open to the public?" I said. "Not generally, no." I looked at him. There was so much I wanted to ask, so much I wanted to say, but somehow I knew that there wasn't time, and even if there was, that it was all somehow beside the point. "Are you happy here?" I said at last. He considered this for a moment. "Not particularly," he said, "but you're not very happy where you are either. St. Basil's and Moscow, Chartres, Salisbury and Amiens." He glanced at his watch. "I hope you'll excuse me," he said, "but I'm late for an appointment." He turned from me and walked away. I watched his back receding down the long, gleaming hall. End quote. The place that Richard walks through in his dream is an old city, he says, like London, bombed up, destroyed, underpopulated. We might think of the bombing of London that happened in World War II. And so the city represents the ruin of the ancient world, the ruin of pagandom, of the bygone empires of pre-modern peoples that we have all built on top of for centuries. And he mentioned seeing ruined statuary. Even the monuments of the old culture are now wrecked. In the aftermath of, say, the world wars, the old world has been killed off entirely. And while some still seem to try and inhabit it, it's being taken over by vines. It's empty, it's overgrown. It's not a living city anymore, it's a ruin. That's the world that Richard has fallen in love with, that he has a romantic longing for. And here at the end of the novel, he's realizing that world has died, and Richard is like a ghost wandering in its ruin. And given that the whole story is also a coming-of-age story about Richard's school days, which he says have defined his entire life, we can see this as an affliction that might not only seize upon pretentious elitist Greek students, but all of us who end up living in a romantic past, who are still gripped by the power of our own past, by the golden years that we yearn for. Richard has left Hampton just as he's left his youth, and he's gone into adulthood in the modern world. And so what does he see next? Rising above this old city, modern architecture, the glowing underlit forms that sort of give the image of something out of a sci-fi novel. This is modernity rising up over the pre-modern world. And when Richard enters one of these buildings, what does he see? People surveying the iconic images from the ancient world on screens. So with a level of separation, looking at visual representations of the past, looking at these iconic monuments of humanity, but sort of just flipping through the images. This is a very modern style of activity or way of engaging with the ancient world. It's not as if it's forgotten per se, but it's no longer alive. It exists in encyclopedias. It's something in memory and imagination. It exists as a still image. And here in this world, he meets Henry. Henry's dead in the physical world, but he says, "I'm not dead. Effectively, I still exist, but my movements are restricted." And if we want to take this scene as having metaphysical significance, we might think again of the Parmenidean notion of being, that nothing arises, nothing perishes. Parmenides believed that change was impossible, that movement was impossible. And so Henry saw into that great insight, shared by the Upanishads. No one passes away. There's no such state of being as death. The truth of reality is an eternal, unchanging, unmoving being. That is what is eternally existent, and that the phenomenal world is illusory. So Henry has only left behind the illusory, changing world of phenomenon and entered a changeless, motionless state. And even if we don't read into the potential Parmenidean implications, we might say Henry's story is done. The story of him has been written and is now in the past, and that means it is fixed in place. It is enclosed by a beginning and end. So he no longer has the freedom to travel, because travel, movement, becoming is no longer real for him. And finally, the dialogue. Are you happy here? Not particularly. Because while there may not be sadness, having entered the sublime, there's certainly no happiness either. Those two things would both seem to be aspects of change and becoming. But more importantly, Henry is not happy in death, but Richard has to admit also that he's not happy in life. And there's a subversive implication which seems to imply, perhaps with a bit of Kierkegaardian wisdom, kill yourself or live out your life. You will regret both in the end. If the dream is merely the product of Richard's subconscious and even has no metaphysical significance, even then it reveals Richard's admiration for the bravery of what Henry did, which we don't tend to think of suicide in those terms these days. But after all of the four friends who lived, Francis, Charles, Camilla, and Richard, had subpar lives after Hampton. Their golden days were that year they spent together in the classics program under Julian at Hampton, and everything was downhill from there. So which is the cowardly decision? Is it to kill yourself, or is it more cowardly to live on knowing that the zest of life will be drained out of it? That you'll forever be a stranger in a strange land that you don't feel yourself really a part of. So I would interpret the dream as Richard's confrontation with the beautiful and terrible fact that in spite of the tragic nature of the story, his murderous actions, the ignominious fates of the main characters, this year was the best year of their lives. So was Julian right to seduce them to the Dionysian? None of you are happy in modernity. Here's a taste of the ritual ecstasy from the ancient world. It's going to bring you all together. It's going to throw your lives into chaos. It'll give you the only story you can ever tell henceforth about your lives. A life's not necessarily better because of a long duration. It could still be a disappointing and banal life. Instead, in a short burst, this group experienced the heights of human emotion and drama and joy and sorrow and frustration and ecstasy, really the whole emotional panoply of human existence. And Richard still yearns for it. But the really tragic nature of the story is the subconscious awareness in this dream of all of that as something in the past that's now gone. And then trying to sort of live in the modern world that's been erected on the wrecks of the ancient. And this is why I connected with the character of Richard, and why, on a personal level, I found the final scene of Richard's dream so relatable. It's a parable, it's an image that conveys the tragedy of romantic longing, that feeling of estrangement and of being misplaced, and a sense of loss and nostalgia for a time that one never knew. And we get no indication that Richard can change. His is the fate of aesthetic man in the modern world. He's not particularly Nietzschean. He's not particularly Platonic. He's not even particularly Dionysian. He's simply a sensitive young man who recognizes the beauty of the past. Yes, the ancient past, but also his own. And he's also forever haunted by that past. And that's the word I would use to describe it, haunting. It is a book that people end up thinking about for a long time afterwards, and wondering why it was that these characters that in many ways do seem superficial and narcissistic and self-absorbed and unlikable, and in some ways indistinguishable from one another, nevertheless continue to fascinate. And it's because, I think, there's so much going on beneath the surface, and there's so much that is designed to seduce and attract us. And even though many of us might not like to admit it, so many people are haunted by their past, their personal past, and so many of us do come to a place in life where we think about those golden years. And I think that bittersweet feeling that final scene conjures it epitomizes that feeling. That's all, everyone, for my analysis of The Secret History, and this concludes the first leg of the season, so let's all raise a glass to Dionysus in celebration of that. I'm going to take a week off, both for my sanity and because I'm about to hit the road again with my band. I need enough time to get content together to cover my absence. I'm about to travel to Mexico to play a music festival down there and then tour the Midwest. I'm very glad to welcome the fall season once again. It's my favorite time of year and a wonderful time to travel the Midwest. I'm expecting to see some beautiful foliage, and I'll, of course, take photos and videos to show all of you. Next episode, we will return to The Gay Science by Friedrich Nietzsche and start to work through Book 2. Amor fati, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.